Welcome to Part 5. In this final video, we will examine the theological context in which Jesus lived. Once we understand this, we will be able to paint a picture of how and why Christianity probably began. No magic required. According to early Jewish beliefs, God promised the Jews that they would enjoy special protections as God's chosen people, and that a descendant of King David would always sit on the throne of Israel. In exchange, the Jews would keep God's laws, such as the Ten Commandments, cleansing rituals, circumcision, and the various dietary restrictions. This was called the covenant between the Jews and God. The Jewish scriptures contain a clear theme that the Jewish people are not perfect and that they often fall short of God's expectations, which is why bad things still happen to them. But they also emphasize that God will ultimately come through for them. For this video, the most important part of the covenant is God's promise that the Jews would always have a Davidic king on the throne of Israel. This king was generally referred to as the Mashiach, or Messiah, which literally means anointed one. As part of the coronation ritual, holy oil would be poured on the king's head, thus anointing them as the Messiah, as the king. Thus, the term Messiah does not refer to one particular individual, but to each king of Israel. The king of Israel was the Messiah. However, the kingdom of Israel was eventually conquered by the Babylonians, who removed the king from power and destroyed the temple, and then by the Persians and eventually the Roman Empire. But wait, didn't God promise that Israel would always have a Davidic king on the throne? If that's true, then how is it that the Jews were conquered and the king dethroned? What about their covenant? What is God going to do to fix this? As a result of this upset, the Jewish people developed the idea that there would be a new Messiah, a new king of Israel, who would set everything right again. This new Messiah would be a blood descendant of David. He would reclaim Israel from its occupiers, rebuild the temple that had been destroyed, and reunite all the Jewish tribes in Israel. This new Messiah would go on to become the king of all nations, create world peace, and bring everyone on earth to worship the one true God of Abraham. Additionally, borrowing from the Zoroastrian Persians, the Jews also came to believe that these events would kickstart the end of the world. Once these messianic events had transpired, God and another divine figure called the Son of Man would descend to earth and resurrect the dead so they may be judged alongside the living. Those who were not righteous would be destroyed, while those who were righteous would become a part of God's perfect, everlasting kingdom on earth, the kingdom of God. In the kingdom of God, all the evil and suffering of our existence would be eradicated, and all people would live in harmony with God. These are the basic tenets of Jewish apocalypticism, which we discussed in Part 2. This was a widely held Jewish belief at the time of Jesus, and this is what Jews expected of the new Messiah. At this point, you can probably see where this video gets its title. Neither the historical Jesus nor the biblical Jesus fits the bill for this new Messiah. The new Messiah was not expected to die or to be resurrected, nor was he expected to be a redeemer of sins, and he certainly was not expected to be God or a literal Son of God. The new Messiah was expected to be a human king who would wield great political power and carry out the aforementioned actions, such as overthrowing the enemies of the Jews and triggering the end of the world. Jesus didn't overthrow the enemies of the Jews, he got his ass kicked by them. You're telling me that guy was the Messiah? What's next? Peter Dinklage is the heavyweight boxing champion of the world? On top of that, Jesus didn't unite the Jews, he didn't create world peace, he didn't rebuild the temple, and he certainly didn't trigger the apocalypse. He did none of the major things the Messiah was supposed to do. The Jesus of the New Testament is clearly not the Jewish Messiah, even if we take the Gospels at face value. This is not some minor technicality where he simply missed a few things here and there, as modern Christians believe. This is the core doctrine of what the Jewish Messiah was supposed to be, which Jesus does not fit. In fact, there are even Christians who agree with this analysis. I was interested to learn that the Christian apologist William Lane Craig agrees that Jesus does not fit the Jewish description of the new Messiah. However, Craig uses this fact to argue that Jesus must have risen from the dead. Otherwise, why would his Jewish followers have maintained that he was the Messiah, when their scriptures clearly said otherwise.
The original disciples suddenly came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus despite every predisposition to the contrary. You see, Jews had no belief in a dying, much less rising, Messiah. And Jewish beliefs about the afterlife prohibited anyone's rising from the dead prior to the general resurrection at the end of the world.
In response to this argument, I'd like to point out that, according to the New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman, most of the early converts to Christianity were not actually Jews, but Gentiles. Most Jews, it seems, did indeed hold to what their scriptures said, and they did not believe that Jesus was the new Messiah. This may also explain why Paul was so insistent that the Jewish laws had been nullified by Jesus. It's much easier to convert non-Jews if they don't have to follow all those weird Jewish laws. Additionally, during his lifetime, Jesus seems to have taught many things that went against traditional Jewish teachings, such as thought crime, turning the other cheek instead of an eye for an eye, and the acceptability of working on the Sabbath. If his followers were already willing to ignore and reinterpret the Jewish scriptures in these ways, then it seems entirely reasonable that they'd be willing to do so in this way as well, bending the idea of the Messiah to fit the man they admired so greatly. As it turns out, we don't even need to speculate about this kind of behavior. We've actually seen it before. There have been other Jewish men in history whose followers believed them to be the Messiah, even though these men clearly didn't fit the bill. Their followers were more than willing to distort the messianic model to fit around the man they admired. For example, there are still some modern Jews who believe that a man named Menachem Mendel Schneerson, a Jewish rabbi who died in 1994, was, and still is, their Messiah, despite his rejection of this idea during his lifetime, and even despite the fact that he's been dead for over 25 years now. There was also another Jewish man in the 17th century named Sabbatai Zevi, who was thought by many Jews to be the new Messiah. That is, until he was forced to convert to Islam. But even then, some of his followers still believed that he was the Messiah, and they declared that it was part of the messianic plan all along that he should be an apostate. You know, bring down the enemy from the inside, or something like that. So, as you'll recall, William Lane Craig's argument was that Jesus must have risen from the dead because this is the only way to explain how some Jews continued to believe that he was the Messiah. However, as we've just seen, you don't need anywhere near that kind of miraculous demonstration to convince a handful of Jews that a non-messianic figure is their Messiah. All you really need is a charismatic leader and enough cognitive dissonance to reinterpret what the Messiah is supposed to be. That being said, another Jew who lived 100 years after Jesus came much closer to the messianic model, and his followers had good reasons for believing him to be the new Messiah at the time. This man's name was Simon Bar Kokhba. In 132 CE, he led a revolt against the Roman Empire, in which he retook Jerusalem. With Jerusalem under his control, he re-established Jewish practices there, began issuing coins in the name of his new government, and started making plans to rebuild the temple. This is what the Messiah was supposed to do. However, Rome continued to fight back, and the empire eventually crushed his rebellion 3 years later, retaking the city of Jerusalem in 135 CE. This was the third and final Jewish-Roman war. He may not have succeeded, but Bar Kokhba was a much better candidate for the new Messiah than Jesus was, not to mention the other Jewish men we've discussed. This is why modern Jews say that they're still waiting for their Messiah. There are clear and obvious expectations that have yet to be met. So, now that we understand what the new Messiah is supposed to be, and why Jesus doesn't fit the bill, even if we take the New Testament at face value, let's answer some common objections to this picture. What about all the messianic prophecies Jesus fulfilled? Before we examine these passages, let's be clear on what is and isn't a prophecy. Number 1, similar story structure is not prophecy. Jesus doing something that reminds you of Moses is not prophecy, nor do passages that speak about past events count as prophecies of future events just because they were paralleled later on. Number 2, writing about something after it happened is not prophecy, as we saw in part 4 with Jesus' supposed prediction of his own death. And number 3, it doesn't count as a prophecy if you'll know it when it happens.
All of prophecy, I think, is somewhat mysterious, so that you recognize it when it happens. You don't necessarily predict it, ahead of time.
If you can't predict it ahead of time, then how is it a prophecy? The whole point is that you're supposed to know it before it happens. You can always find patterns in something after it happens, but that's not prophecy, nor does it demonstrate that the outcome was planned in advance. Incidentally, it seems that the Jews did it the right way. They identified beforehand the prophecies which they believed to be messianic, and which Jesus did not fulfill. These prophecies form the basis of the messianic picture we've outlined, and this picture does not look like Jesus. This is why early Christians didn't have much success converting Jews. But maybe we've missed something. Maybe there are yet more messianic prophecies that Jesus did fulfill, as Christians often claim. So, what specific prophecies did Jesus fulfill that were messianic, and which Jews have either missed or chosen to ignore? Isaiah 53:4. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. The person being described in this passage, the servant, is Israel. The Old Testament frequently personifies Israel in the second and third person, such as in Isaiah 41:8 and 49:3, and it frequently describes how Israel is punished by God for not keeping the law. This passage is indicating that Israel's suffering will bring about atonement for the sins of its people. Nowhere in this passage does it describe the servant as the Messiah, nor does it describe anything apocalyptic. For these reasons, ancient Jews never thought of Isaiah 53 as being messianic. Additionally, if you keep reading, Isaiah 53:10 says of the servant that the Lord will see his offspring and prolong his days, neither of which could apply to Jesus, who had no offspring or descendants, and whose days were certainly not prolonged. That was kind of the whole point. Furthermore, the descriptions of suffering are written in past tense, so it doesn't really count as a prophecy. It's describing something that, apparently, has already happened, which makes sense if it's talking about Israel. Moving on to Daniel 3:25. In this story, 3 Jewish men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are thrown into a furnace as capital punishment for refusing to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue. But when Nebuchadnezzar looks into the furnace, not only does he see the 3 men unharmed, but he also sees a 4th man, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. This 4th man would seem to be Jesus. This isn't exactly a prophecy, but it would certainly be evidence of Jesus in the Jewish scriptures. However, the original Aramaic actually says that the 4th man has the appearance of a son of the gods, or has the appearance of a god, which, in context, sounds more like an angel. Of course, you could interpret this to be talking about Jesus, but that's not the most honest reading of the text. This is underscored by the fact that Jews never read this passage and thought, "Wow, Yahweh has a son? I never knew that." They read it as an angel. Isaiah 7:14. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. In this passage, the original Hebrew actually says that a young woman has conceived and will bear a son. The Hebrew word used to refer to this woman is alma, which most often means young woman. If the author really meant virgin, he would have used the word betulah, which most often means virgin, and which is used in other passages which do specifically describe women who are virgins. Furthermore, this passage is actually part of a self-contained story, which doesn't have anything to do with the Messiah. In this story, the king of Judah, Ahaz, is being attacked by 2 other kings, Rezin, the king of Aram, and Pekah, the king of Israel. God tells Ahaz that the other kings will not succeed. God then tells Ahaz that he will provide a sign. A young woman has conceived a son, and she will call him Emmanuel. Before this boy is old enough to reject bad and choose good, the land of the two kings you dread shall be abandoned. The son called Emmanuel is simply being used as a measure of time. Before the boy is old enough to understand moral decision-making, these enemy kings will go away, and then God will bless the land of Judah. This is clearly not a messianic passage. It's simply an assurance that, within 5 years or so, the hostile kingdoms will go away. Isaiah 9:6. For a child has been born for us, a son given to us. Authority rests on his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. This does sound a lot like Jesus, except that the very next verse says that, because of this child, there will be endless peace forevermore for the throne of David and his kingdom, which there obviously wasn't after Jesus. Even if this is meant to be messianic, it's clear that Jesus doesn't fit the bill. Furthermore, it seems that in the original Hebrew, the verb used in this passage is missing a subject, which creates ambiguity. It could also be translated as something like, the wondrous advisor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, called his name, the Prince of Peace. This means that the God words may not actually apply to the child himself. Additionally, this passage is written in past tense, and it says that the child has already been born for us, which certainly doesn't apply to Jesus at this time. It's also worth noting that, at this point in the text, King Ahaz of Judah has been failing as a ruler, whereas his son and successor, Hezekiah, was a much better and more successful king who arguably did deliver his people from darkness. Isaiah 9:6 is either predicting the better king, Hezekiah, or it's simply using the child as a measure of time, like Isaiah 7:14 did. In any case, the fact that Jesus did not create endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom should be a dead giveaway that Jesus did not fulfill this prophecy. Zechariah 9:9. Lo, your king comes to you, triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. This passage probably is messianic, and I have no trouble believing that the historical Jesus did fulfill it, although this prophecy could easily be fulfilled by anyone who was familiar with it and had access to a donkey. Additionally, the passage doesn't end there. It goes on to say, He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. This is very much in line with Jewish messianic apocalypticism, and Jews do believe that these words are messianic. But Jesus did not do these things. If he had, other ancient societies would have noticed that world peace had happened, and Christians would be proclaiming it as yet another fulfilled prophecy. But since that's not the case, and since this did not happen, they usually stop reading after the word donkey. The honest thing to do would be to admit that this prophecy was not fulfilled. Oh, but he rode a donkey. That's the important part. I guess anyone could be a Messiah back in those days. Psalm 110. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The claim with this passage is that there are two lords. One is God, and the other must be Jesus. First, it's worth mentioning that God certainly did not make Jesus' enemies his footstool. Jesus' enemies killed him. Sure, perhaps he didn't stay dead for long, but his enemies still prospered afterward, so this supposed prophecy was certainly not fulfilled. Second, the Hebrew word used for the first Lord is Jehovah, which exclusively means God, but the Hebrew word used for the second Lord is Adonai, which generally refers to a superior of any kind, although it can be used as a substitute for God's name. If both lords were supposed to be God, then you'd expect both words to be Jehovah, and for the author to have spent a little more time on the fact that God now exists in two persons all of a sudden. Now, you could interpret this passage as referring to the rapture when Jesus will return, and this would certainly be less of a stretch than some of the other prophecies we've examined, but it seems to me that a much more honest reading is that this psalm was written by a third party, someone who was a subject of King David. The Lord, Jehovah, says to my Lord, Adonai, David, so-and-so. This third-party author is describing how God was going to help the nation of Israel conquer its enemies, which is a common theme throughout the Psalms. While many people believe that King David wrote all the Psalms, it's not actually possible to attribute their authorship to him, and it's unlikely that he wrote more than half of them. This is underscored by the fact that the phrase Psalm of David can also be translated as Psalm for David or Psalm to David. Thus, this seemingly strange passage can easily be explained by third-party authorship, being written for David or to David by someone under his rule. Furthermore, this passage goes on to say, "Your people will offer themselves willingly on the day you lead your forces," and "Your youth will come to you," and "The Lord will shatter kings," and "execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses." This was not fulfilled by Jesus. Psalm 22:16. "For dogs have surrounded me. The congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet." First, this passage is clearly not talking about the Messiah. The context makes it clear that it's talking about King David as he's being attacked by his enemies. And second, the original Hebrew in this passage is ambiguous, and it's difficult to get an exact translation to English. However, a more accurate translation would be something like a lion, they have surrounded my hands and my feet," or "My hands and feet have shriveled." The author's intention is to convey the idea of powerlessness, of being trapped or unable to act. It is not describing a specific type of physical injury. This makes sense given the surrounding context. These words were translated as pierced either because of the ambiguity or to make this passage sound more like Jesus, even though it's clearly not talking about the Messiah in the first place. It's talking about King David's feeling of powerlessness and of being trapped. And finally, as with the other Psalms, this passage is past tense. Thus, it's difficult to argue that it's predicting anything. Psalm 34:20. "He guards all his bones, not one of them is broken." This passage is referenced in the Passion narrative in John 19:36, which claims that Jesus' bones were not broken as part of his crucifixion. However, as with the other passages, you need to read the full context. This is not a messianic prophecy. It's about how bad things may happen, but God will come through in the end. You may be injured, but it's nothing you can't recover from. The context makes it clear that this passage is not talking about the Messiah. The author of John either misread or misheard this passage and mistakenly believed it to be messianic. But as far as misunderstanding the Old Testament goes, John is not our worst offender. That honor goes to Matthew. The author of Matthew seems particularly determined to have Jesus fulfilling all sorts of Jewish prophecies, but he doesn't seem to understand the prophecies that he has Jesus fulfilling. For example, he doesn't seem to understand that, in the Old Testament, the Jewish people and their nation are frequently referred to as a person, even though it's clear that the author is talking about Israel as a whole in these passages. Hosea 11:1, for example, recalls the Exodus by saying, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Matthew seems to have thought that this verse was referring to Jesus, the Son of God, so he invented an entire story in which Jesus' family goes to live in Egypt to escape King Herod's wrath. Then, after Herod dies, Jesus' family leaves Egypt and returns to Judea, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, "Out of Egypt I called my son." The author of Matthew clearly didn't understand, or chose to ignore, what the original passage was actually talking about. The Son is clearly stated to be Israel, not the Messiah. As one final example of Matthew's misunderstanding of the Jewish scriptures, Matthew 21, 1-7 references Zechariah 9:9, which, as we've seen, is a messianic prophecy, so at least he got that right, but Matthew mistakes the poetic repetition of the donkey to mean that the Messiah will in fact arrive by awkwardly straddling two donkeys, one a colt and one a mature adult. Matthew was so determined to have Jesus fulfill these prophecies that he not only turned innocuous passages into messianic prophecies, but he was willing to write things that were just plain absurd, just to make sure that he covered all of his bases. As a nice little summary of these types of problems, where the New Testament authors misquote and misinterpret Old Testament scriptures, here is Dr. Joshua Bowen.
The way that the New Testament authors use Old Testament prophecy often doesn't line up with their Old Testament contexts, and they were okay with that. It wasn't a problem for them because that type of usage in the New Testament's fine. They have different concepts about keeping things. We would have a problem taking something out of context, right? That wasn't necessarily the case for them.
There are many more supposed prophecies that Jesus supposedly fulfilled, but there's simply not enough time to go through them all. The ones I've presented here are definitely the most popular ones, and the others generally suffer from the same types of problems. Alright, next objection. But God demands blood to forgive sins, so it makes perfect sense that God would use a perfect human sacrifice to achieve it. Setting aside the fact that sacrifice as atonement for sins has nothing to do with the Messiah in Judaism, the first part of the statement is actually false. The Old Testament, while not 100% consistent on this subject, has many passages which say that God does not require blood sacrifices to forgive people. One passage which does say that God requires blood is Leviticus 17, 10-12, in which God says that it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul when sacrificed on the altar, and that Jews should not, therefore, eat blood. However, other passages suggest otherwise, such as Leviticus 5:11, which says that you can sacrifice a small amount of flour if you are poor, and your sins will be forgiven. No blood required. In fact, other passages seem to indicate that you don't need to sacrifice at all. Hosea 6:6 says that God desires steadfast love and not sacrifice. Proverbs 21:3 says that to do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. Micah 6:8 says that the only thing that is required is that you do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. Psalm 141 verse 2 asks God to let prayer be counted as incense and the lifting up of my hands as an evening sacrifice. And 2 Chronicles 7:14 says that God will forgive his people's sins if they simply turn from their wicked ways and seek him. There is even one passage, Psalm 78:34-39, in which God seems to forgive people who haven't even repented, because he is compassionate and he understands that they are but flesh. It seems that, in Judaism, sacrifice is a nice gesture, like giving a gift to apologize to someone, but the gift by itself is not necessary, nor is it sufficient. How does this square with Leviticus 17? Well, I'm not really sure. I'm not going to sit here and defend Judaism, I think it has its own problems, but suffice it to say, the doctrine of requiring a blood sacrifice is far from concrete in the Jewish scriptures. And even if it were, even if blood was required to atone for sins, Jesus had a rather non-Jewish way of sacrificing himself. You'd think that, if Jesus was intended as a sacrifice for sins, then he would have been sacrificed on the altar in the temple, and he would have been bled or burned, in the way that sacrifices were meant to be given. Or, if Jesus was intended to replace the Jewish practice of burdening a scapegoat with the sins of the people, then he should have been driven out into the wilderness to die there, as the scapegoat was. But this is not how Christians believe Jesus died. Not at all. Thus, if Jesus' death really was intended as a sacrifice for sins, then you would need to explain why Jesus was sacrificed in this completely irrelevant and non-Jewish way. If Jesus was intended to be a sacrifice for sins, well, he did it completely wrong. It's also worth pointing out that, in the Old Testament, there are at least 2 passages in which God explains that vicarious redemption of one person through another is not how he operates. In Deuteronomy 24:16, God says that people may only be put to death for their own crimes, not for the crimes of others, such as those of their children or their parents. And in Exodus 32:30, God says that he will not punish Moses for the sins of his people, despite Moses' request. Rather, he will punish the individual people who have sinned. This is yet another inconvenience for the idea that Jesus was punished for the sins of other people. So, not only does the God of the Jewish scriptures not require a blood sacrifice, he arguably doesn't require any sacrifice as long as you're truly sorry, although it's certainly a nice gesture to sacrifice something if you can. Furthermore, this idea has nothing to do with the Messiah, and even if it did, Jesus went about sacrificing himself in a completely non-kosher way, with no semblance of the proper sacrificial rituals. If being executed by crucifixion was good enough, then why didn't Jesus just jump off a cliff, or slit his throat, or drink poison? But regardless of how Jesus was killed, the point remains that his death as a sacrifice would have been pointless anyway, because the God of the Old Testament has the ability to forgive without a sacrifice. He also specifically condemned vicarious redemption of one person through the punishment of another. And to top it all off, Jesus was sacrificed in a completely non-kosher way. The idea that Jesus was a blood sacrifice to atone for sins is completely incongruent with Judaism, except perhaps superficially. But what about all the miracles Jesus performed? Don't those prove that he was the Messiah? Well, no, they don't. After all, other people in the Bible could perform miracles too, and not just the people who followed God. In Exodus, the Pharaoh's magicians are able to replicate the miracles of Moses and Aaron. They turned their staffs into snakes, they turned the river to blood, and they made frogs appear in droves. Clearly, miracles don't prove that someone is the Messiah, or even that they have God on their side. And even if Jesus was the only person in the entire Bible who had ever performed miracles, that wouldn't prove that he was the Messiah. Nowhere do the Jewish scriptures say that the Messiah would be revealed by performing miracles. The scriptures make it clear that the Messiah would be revealed by his actions of reuniting the Jewish tribes, rebuilding the temple, establishing world peace, and so on. Jesus' supposed miracles not only pale in comparison, but they are also completely irrelevant to whether or not he was the Messiah. In summary, Jesus could not have been the Jewish Messiah, even if we grant everything the Gospels say about him. From a purely theological perspective, based on what we've learned about Judaism and Jewish apocalypticism, Jesus Christ is a nonsensical term. He did none of the things the Messiah was supposed to do, and the idea that the Messiah had to die so that God could forgive our sins is simply laughable from a Jewish perspective. Combine this information with everything else we've covered in this series, and the story of Jesus becomes very sketchy indeed. The nature of eyewitness testimony, the legendary development that we know can and did take place, the authorship of the Gospels, the history of the text, and the theological problems. Everything about Jesus should cast serious doubt on the traditional story, and on the theology woven around it. However, this information doesn't simply undercut the traditional story, it actually tells an entirely different story, a story that explains not only the facts we know, but also the theology that developed in light of those facts. When you consider all the information we've covered in this video series, the true story of Jesus' life and death comes into focus. Now that we've reached the end of the series, we can reconstruct what Jesus and his followers actually did and what they actually believed. This will ultimately show us how Christianity probably began. As before, my point is not to prove that Jesus couldn't have performed miracles, or that the resurrection couldn't have happened, or even that my version of events is exactly correct. My point is simply to show that the facts we have are better explained by non-miraculous means, and that if modern Christians were presented with similar claims and similar evidence from another religion, they would reject the claims of that other religion without a second thought, especially if there was a plausible, mundane explanation readily available. With that understood, this is what I think really happened 2,000 years ago. Jesus was a real human being who was born in Nazareth. This may be a contentious issue among internet atheists, but I think the simplest explanation for the facts at hand is that a historical Jesus probably did exist. One of the many reasons for thinking this is the fact that Matthew and Luke both contain rather contrived-sounding birth narratives about him. Both of these narratives describe how Jesus of Nazareth was actually born in Bethlehem, either because King Herod was persecuting him or because of a census that didn't actually happen, but whatever. This is important because of the messianic prophecy found in Micah 5:2, which says that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. Thus, if Jesus is the Messiah, then he had to have been born in Bethlehem. Simple. These birth narratives are significant because if Jesus was an invented character, if he never existed, then these early Christian authors would simply have written that he was born in Bethlehem. The fact that they, instead, chose to write apologies for a man who hailed from Nazareth seems to indicate that this was an inconvenient truth that had to be retconned. If Jesus were fictional, then he could have been born anywhere, no fake census required. Instead, they had to get him to be born in Bethlehem. As I said, this is not the only reason for thinking there was a historical Jesus, but it's a good one. So, Jesus was a real man, and he was a committed Jew. Following the apocalyptic theology of his day, Jesus believed that the end of the world was at hand, and he wanted to prepare everyone for the coming kingdom of God. He did this by making sure that everyone was on their best behavior for when God showed up. Don't commit adultery? Don't even think about committing adultery. Don't murder? Don't even have hatred. He did not come to abolish the law, but to ensure that it was fulfilled. In fact, many passages in the Gospels, as well as some of the larger themes, actually make better sense through an apocalyptic lens. As just one example, in Matthew and Luke, Jesus tells a man to follow him and to not delay by first burying his father, saying, "Let the dead bury their own dead." This passage always seemed strange to me. What kind of advice is that? What kind of moral teaching is that? Should we just leave dead people wherever they keeled over? This passage just doesn't sound right. Unless, of course, Jesus thought the end of the world was near, in which case, there'd really be no point in burying your dead father. The dead are about to be raised anyway for final judgment. Why would you go through all the trouble of burying your father under those circumstances? Suddenly, this passage makes perfect sense. The same goes for Jesus' instruction to not worry about your life, what you will eat, or what you will drink, as expressed in Matthew 6:25. This is clearly not a sustainable long-term strategy, but it makes perfect sense if you think the world is about to end. Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet who was preparing himself and everyone around him for the coming kingdom of God here on earth. And it was coming very soon. Some of you standing here will not taste death until they see that the kingdom of God has come in power. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. And this was by no means an unusual belief. Jesus would have been one of many apocalyptic teachers who existed around this time. The only truly radical idea surrounding Jesus was the idea that he himself was the apocalyptic Messiah, the new King of the Jews. Even if Jesus himself didn't believe that he was the Messiah, it's clear that some people did believe he was the Messiah, and that's the important part. One of the many reasons for thinking that this claim was made about Jesus is that the sign which was supposedly posted above his cross, which read, "King of the Jews," is likely historical. This is because it satisfies the criterion of dissimilarity. That is, it's not a Christological title that later Christians would have invented. Christians have never called Jesus the King of the Jews, nor would they. Jesus is our guy, not the Jews' guy. This is just one of the many reasons why most historians believe that the claim that Jesus was the Messiah is historical and that it was contemporary with his lifetime. That being said, I think that Jesus himself did believe that he was the Messiah. This not only helps to explain why other people believed this about him, but it also makes sense of the events of his final days and of his execution, as we'll see in a minute. Of course, as with his other teachings, his interpretation of the messianic idea was markedly different from the traditional Jewish teaching, although it was not completely off base. he still believed that the Messiah would be an apocalyptic figure who would be instrumental at the end of the world. He simply believed that he was that Messiah. Additionally, I think Jesus himself may have been a manic, that is, a person who can sustain long periods of great excitement or euphoria, delusions, and overactivity. This would simultaneously make sense of his ability to capture people's imagination, and it would make sense of his extreme moments of both anger and compassion in Mark, our earliest gospel. This may have also been what led him to believe that he was the new Messiah. If a man developed this kind of personality disorder in his adult life, in an era before psychology existed, and in a religious context which told him that he could telepathically communicate with the God who was about to destroy the world with the help of one special man, I mean, I get it. I really couldn't fault the man for thinking that maybe, just maybe, he might be the Messiah. And finally, I think Jesus may even have performed the same types of miracles that modern religious figures perform, such as Satya Sai Baba. He did this either believing them himself or knowing that they were deceptions, but justifying those deceptions to himself on the grounds that they brought people to God, which, after all, is the most important thing if the end really is near. However, in spite of his messianic image, and in spite of his sizable following, it soon became apparent that Jesus was in no position to do the things the Messiah was supposed to do. If he really was the Messiah, then he should overthrow the Roman Empire, rebuild the temple, become the ruler of all nations, the King of Kings, as it were, and bring about the end of the world. Upon seeing that Jesus of Nazareth was all bark and no bite, the Jewish people realized that they couldn't risk being associated with him because he couldn't protect them from the Romans, with his messianic image being a direct challenge to the authority of Rome. And you do not directly challenge the authority of Rome. You especially don't challenge the authority of Rome during the Passover, which, by its very nature, was a form of silent protest against Roman rule, as it echoed the Jews' captivity in Egypt. Thus, in order to protect the Jewish people, one or more Jews called out Jesus to the Romans, and his clear challenge to Roman rule. Better that the Romans heard it from the Jews rather than finding it out for themselves.
You can smash this drug barn all you want, but first you'll have to smash our heads open like ripe melons!
This man does not represent us.
The specific circumstances of his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane may well be legendary. However, I think there's a strong case to be made for the historicity of the overall account, one which fits very nicely into the story so far. The accounts of Jesus' final hours appear to contain a subtle parallel with an Old Testament prophecy, one which Jews do believe to be messianic, but which the Gospel authors don't call specific attention to. Why is this important? Well, because this prophecy, which appears in Zechariah 14, was clearly not fulfilled by Jesus. And yet, the Gospel authors still wrote accounts that seem to indicate Jesus' attempt, and failure, to fulfill it. This prophecy in Zechariah 14 describes how God will descend to the Mount of Olives and destroy the city of Jerusalem at the beginning of the apocalypse. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravished. Half of the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations, as he fights in the day of battle. And in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall be split in two, from east to west, making a very large valley. Half of the mountain shall move toward the north, and half of it toward the south. It continues for many more verses, describing the apocalypse in detail. This is interesting because the Gospels say that Jesus was arrested in the garden at the base of the Mount of Olives, just outside of Jerusalem, after predicting its destruction, with his disciples carrying swords for the first and only time in the story. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus specifically tells his disciples to go out and buy swords. This is very much at odds with Jesus' supposed message of love and peace, but it's very much in line with the prophecy in Zechariah 14, which describes a battle of the nations at the start of the apocalypse. I think Jesus did go to the Mount of Olives, specifically with the hope that this prophecy would be fulfilled that very night, and that the end of the world would finally arrive as he had predicted. He probably said something about this publicly before going to the garden, which is why he told his disciples to keep watch and to bring swords. This would also be why he was arrested on that particular night. Not only had he called himself a king in private, but now he had promised specific military action, and he had taken the first step in his messianic campaign. If someone was thinking of betraying him in order to save the rest of the Jews from the wrath of the Romans, this would be their last chance. It's better to denounce your group members' true colors yourself before your enemies discover them on their own, and it seems that Jesus' true colors were about to be made crystal clear, one way or another.
What did Judas betray? I don't think Judas betrayed simply where Jesus could be found in private. I think Judas spilled the beans. Jesus had been teaching his disciples that he would be the ruler and they would rule under him, and Judas went to the authorities and told them. And that's why Pilate knew that Jesus was calling himself the King of the Jews. And when he accused Jesus of it at his trial, Jesus couldn't very well say no, because he thought he was the future King of the Jews. And so they killed him for it. It makes sense of everything. It makes sense of Jesus' teaching. It makes sense of Judas's betrayal. It makes sense of Jesus' execution.
That was the New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman, who believes that Jesus was a pacifist and that he was simply expecting the apocalypse to unfold in front of him. However, another New Testament scholar and Episcopalian Christian, Dale Martin, has gone further. He believes that Jesus intended to participate in the righteous violence of the imminent apocalypse. He outlines this idea in his paper, Jesus in Jerusalem, Armed and Not Dangerous. I personally lean more toward Martin's conclusion over Ehrman's, but the key takeaway from both is that Jesus was expecting the apocalypse that night, and it didn't happen. One supporting piece of evidence for Martin's conclusion is that the disciples' carrying of swords in the garden is probably historical, as he explains in one of his lectures.
Somebody had a sword at Jesus' arrest in the garden, and somebody used it. According to the different traditions, it was Peter, according to John, and somebody made, the others don't name, somebody whacked off the ear of the high priest's slave. But there's these different stories about Jesus, somebody in Jesus' entourage was armed, and in some of the sources, one of the sources, there are two of them armed. There are two swords, others is one sword. Now, I think this is historical. Why? Because all the gospel writers want to go out of their way to say Jesus was not mounting a violent revolution. He was not a criminal. This was not an armed rebellion. He's completely innocent of any political charge of insurrection. But if Jesus' disciples were armed with swords at his arrest in the middle of the night at the Passover in Jerusalem, that's insurrection, folks. The Romans did not allow Jews just to go around in the middle of the night in gardens carrying swords. For a Jew to be armed at the Passover, an especially dangerous time that the Romans were really worried about, for a Jew to be armed, following around a guy who some people were saying was the King of the Jews, you can be arrested for that. You can be crucified for that. So I don't think early Christians invented it. I think some of these early Christians knew that at least one and possibly more of Jesus' disciples were armed at his arrest. So that's another, why do I see that? Because it's not something they would have invented. In fact, it goes against their tendency.
Based on similar evidence, namely the dissimilarity with what later Christian authors would invent, the concordance with Jesus' apocalyptic message, and the parallels with Zechariah 14, I think the entire story of Jesus' arrest probably contains a historical core, and that Jesus was expecting the start of the apocalypse as described in Zechariah 14. It makes sense of the accounts of Jesus' arrest, of his relocation to Jerusalem, of his betrayal by the Jews, and of his execution. And this is why I think Jesus probably did predict the fall of Jerusalem and/or the destruction of the temple, but not exactly, as I mentioned in part 4. Jesus believed that it would happen as part of the apocalypse, not as part of a Jewish-Roman war that occurred 40 years later. So you could say that he got the right answer for the wrong reason. In any case, as a result of his messianic claims and his declaration of military action, Jesus was arrested and crucified for treason, just like any other Jewish rebel at the time, with the title King of the Jews likely paraded around him as a mockery of his ideology. The crucifixion itself, along with this particular title, is probably historical, but many other details surrounding the crucifixion probably are not, as they appear to be either literary allusions to the Old Testament or just more examples of poorly done prophecies. As part of his crucifixion, Jesus was left on the cross for a few days, so that his body would be ravaged by scavenging birds, just like any other crucified person. Remember, this was a fundamental purpose of crucifixion, to humiliate and publicly destroy the person's body. What little we know about the practice of crucifixion indicates that this is how and why it was done. After a few days on the cross, what remained of his body was thrown into a mass grave, again, just like any other crucified person. And that was the end of the so-called Messiah. But the story didn't end there. After Jesus' death, some of his followers couldn't accept that this man had not been their Messiah, and yet, they'd seen him die. They couldn't deny the fact that he had died and that he wasn't walking around anymore, but they just couldn't believe that he hadn't been their Messiah. This was a huge problem for them. If Jesus really was our Messiah, then why did he die? And even worse, why did he die without doing the things he was supposed to do, like overthrowing the Roman Empire, rebuilding the temple, raising the dead, and bringing about the end of the world to establish God's kingdom on earth? To answer these questions, these early Christians, still calling themselves Jews, invented new theology in order to justify what had happened. First, they had to explain why Jesus had died. As we saw in part 4 of this series, there were multiple explanations proposed by early Christians. The Gnostics, for example, believed that it was simply his chosen method for escaping his physical body, allowing him to return to the spiritual realm. However, the proto-Orthodox Christians had a different explanation. To explain why God had allowed Jesus to die, these followers of Jesus reasoned that it must have been a punishment of some kind, since God must have been in control of the situation. He's God. But it was inconceivable that Jesus had been punished for something he did, since he was a righteous man who followed God. Therefore, they reasoned, he must have been punished for what other people did. It's like a sacrifice. Just like we do with animals, but this sacrifice must have been a really big deal because it was God's chosen human. It all makes sense now. Jesus was a sacrifice for the rest of us. That explains why he died, and why he endured such a horrible punishment. He was the ultimate sacrifice. God gave us a better thing to sacrifice so that we may appease him like we never have before. Rather than admitting that Jesus' death was incompatible with Scripture, and not what they had been expecting, his followers declared that it was part of the plan all along, which they had to do to save face, otherwise they'd look stupid for following a Messiah who got his ass kicked. Nope, it was part of the plan all along. 4D chess, kofefe. It was a simple matter of someone saying, "I meant to do that," after failing spectacularly.
I meant to do that.
Decades later, this belief was codified in the letters of Paul and the Gospel of Mark. This is the same behavior we saw from the followers of Sabbatai Zevi and Menachem Mendel Schneerson. If your favorite rabbi doesn't fit the messianic model, well, the model must have been wrong. With this idea in hand, Jesus' followers now had a justification for why their so-called Messiah had died. It wasn't a mistake, and it clearly wasn't a failure. No, it was all part of a master plan to atone for our sins. It was supposed to happen all along. Trust me. Next, they had to answer the more specific question of why Jesus had died without having done the things that were promised in the Hebrew Scriptures, not the least of which was that he quite conspicuously had not brought about the end of the world. Fortunately, a most convenient answer came about. Jesus was alive again. No, really, I saw him. Where is he now? Well, he only came back for a little while before ascending to heaven, so you can't go and meet him right now. I know that it looks like he's still dead, but he's not. Trust me. This Elvis resurrection claim, allowed Jesus' followers to believe that maybe Jesus is still going to do all the things the scriptures promised. Just later. Maybe he'll come back to Earth someday to finish what he started. Incidentally, as we've seen in previous videos, this kind of spiritual transformation and adoption by the gods was also a common pagan belief at the time, in which virtuous people could be adopted by the gods during their lives and then transformed into a god after their death. Examples of this include Julius Caesar, who, among other Roman emperors, was believed to have been exalted to heaven after his death. Applying this Hellenistic idea to Jesus would have been trivial, and it allowed his followers to maintain that he was still going to do all the messianic deeds required of him. Just, later. And, of course, we do need to talk about the post-death appearances of Jesus, which seem to have been key to the start of Christianity as a religion. Jesus' brief post-death appearances were either an honest mistake of grief-induced hallucination, which I'll explain in just a minute, or they were an intentional deception used to manufacture eyewitness testimony in support of these new theological claims. While the Gospels and the letters of Paul say that many people saw Jesus alive again, it actually could have been as few as 1 or 2 hallucinations, or liars, to generate the accounts we have, as you've probably noticed from watching the previous videos in this series. This would also explain why Jesus' followers maintained that he had been exalted to heaven after his resurrection, rather than simply being alive again and practicing his ministry for another 30 years. After all, if he really did come back to life, where was he? Why couldn't the author of Mark have gone and spoken to old man Jesus? The idea that Jesus disappeared shortly after his resurrection is simply too convenient for someone who supposedly came back to life, but it makes perfect sense if the eyewitnesses were either lying or mistaken, and Jesus was actually still dead. Regardless of how the post-death appearances first sprang up, the idea that Jesus was resurrected and then exalted to heaven became the linchpin to the new theology. He was still going to do all the messianic deeds, which meant he could still be the Messiah, and it explained why no one could go and meet Jesus now that he was alive again. He conveniently ascended to heaven shortly afterward. Kind of like how the angel that gave Joseph Smith the golden plates conveniently took them away once Joseph had finished translating them. It's just a little too convenient. Sorry, Jesus isn't here right now, but trust me, he totally came back to life for a little while. Besides, some people saw him alive again. Which people? Like James, Cephas, good luck tracking them down to confirm this, the 500? Lots of people. Reliable people. The best people. Shut up and drink your covfefe. As for Jesus' body being gone, I think this was a legendary development that grew and spread as people began asking for evidence of a bodily resurrection. Based on what we know about crucifixion and about Jesus' political situation, it's very unlikely that his body would have been removed from the cross in any timely manner, or that he would have been buried in a tomb, as I'll explain in just a minute. However, even if the missing body wasn't a legendary development, even if it was rooted in an actual event, we could easily suppose that Jesus' body was missing from his cross after a few days, which would usually seem to be the case, and that this was mistakenly conveyed as his body being gone after a few rounds of the telephone game. Or his body was simply reported missing from the mass grave, which would have been the burial that Paul refers to. Okay, but then wouldn't people just go and point to his body in the mass grave to prove that he's still dead? Well, perhaps they tried, but good luck identifying his body in a mass grave after days of decomposing and being eaten by birds. By all rights, his body would have been gone one way or another. That's what bodies do, especially given that the purpose of crucifixion was to destroy the body. One way or another, exaggeration or pure fiction, the claim was born that Jesus' body was gone, that he'd been buried, the tomb specifically being a later legendary development, and that he must have come back to life in order to do all of the things that the Messiah was supposed to do in the first place, because otherwise, he's not the Messiah, and we know that can't be true. Now it all made sense. Jesus died because God needed a better sacrifice, and Jesus is still going to do all the messianic deeds he was supposed to do because he came back to life. He's just going to do them later. And no, you can't go talk to the resurrected Jesus because he conveniently ascended to heaven. That's why he isn't walking around anymore, even though we just said he's alive again. This new theology was now compatible with the fact that Jesus had died, and with the fact that he didn't actually do what the Messiah was supposed to do. This is how I think Christianity probably began, and why it developed into the religion we know today.
Jesus thought of himself as the Messiah. Did he think of himself as the crucified Messiah? I don't think so. I don't think Jesus was planning to die. I think Jesus expected that the Son of Man was going to arrive and he would be installed as king. Mark's entire gospel was a literary attempt to explain. Mark has a really difficult situation in front of him. Mark is the first gospel to be written. The author of Mark thinks that Jesus is the Messiah, and the author of Mark knows that Jesus got crucified. Those two things are contradictory in Jewish thinking. Mark had to explain how it is that Jesus could be the Messiah if he got crucified. And that's what the whole gospel ultimately is about. It's absolutely right.
The Gospel of Mark is largely, I would call, an apology for a crucified Messiah. That's the main purpose of Mark. Mark is dealing with the issue of, well, how can he be the Messiah if he's crucified? And Mark is arguing that he's not the Messiah despite the cross, but precisely because of it.
Based on what we know about the historical Jesus, Jewish apocalypticism, and early Christian beliefs, my conclusion is that the religion we now call Christianity is simply a retcon for a failed Messiah. Christianity is nothing more than Jewish theological damage control, which became too elaborate to still be called Judaism. As much as I'd like to end on that dramatic note, there's still some housekeeping to do. There are a few standard objections to this view of Jesus, which I have yet to address. But some people were taken down from the cross and given a proper burial. Jesus could easily have been one of these people. It's true that crucifixion victims were occasionally taken down and properly buried. However, the specific circumstances of Jesus' crucifixion make it very unlikely that this would have been done for him. Jesus had no family in Jerusalem to whom his body would have been given, nor was it the emperor's birthday, an occasion on which bodies may sometimes have been taken down. Furthermore, Jesus was likely executed for insurrection and treason, and these types of criminals were rarely, if ever, allowed to be taken down and properly buried. And finally, as we saw in Part 4, it's exceedingly unlikely that Pontius Pilate would have agreed to hand over the body of anyone being crucified. He is reported to have been exceedingly ruthless. In fact, he was eventually removed from his position, and it's suspected that this may have been because of how ruthless he was, even by Roman standards. While it is true that bodies were sometimes taken down, everything about Jesus' situation seems to suggest that this would have been extremely unlikely. But then where did the idea of an empty tomb even come from? That's such a strange thing to make up. It's not really that strange at all. If you want to claim that someone physically rose from the dead, the obvious first question someone would ask is, well, did you check to see if his body's still there? The person who had just told the story, trusting the person who told them, probably said something like, well, yeah, sure they did. Why would they tell me Jesus rose if they hadn't even checked? The real answer, of course, is because that person was a fanatic who was distraught by their hero's death and emboldened by what could have been an Elvis sighting. As this idea was passed down, it went from supposedly true to probably true to almost certainly true. I'm sure many of you have seen this kind of thing happen in your own lives. Someone will propose something, and that idea slowly becomes more and more certain the longer it exists, because everyone trusts the person they heard it from, and they are unwilling to backtrack the idea because that person must know something I don't. We've even seen this in the history of the Bible itself. What starts as a marginal note can eventually become scripture. Additionally, I think the specific number of 3 days between Jesus' death and the resurrection may have been yet another prophetic misinterpretation, this time coming from Hosea 6, 1-2, in which the author writes that Israel has strayed from the Lord, who has struck us down as a result, but the Lord will raise us up on the 3rd day that we may live before him. Of course, this passage is not talking about the Messiah, but as we've seen, mistaking Israel for the Messiah is par for the course with the Gospel authors. Thus, Jesus became raised up on the 3rd day. What about the post-death appearances? You can't just write those off as oral traditions no better than rumors. Don't these accounts demand an explanation? Well, as we saw in Part 4, there's really not much to explain if we look at the textual evidence. Paul's account is the only one in which an author actually makes a first-hand claim to seeing a resurrected Jesus, albeit years later in what sounds like a vision. His claim that the 500 saw Jesus is not, in and of itself, evidence that groups of people actually saw him. Paul is simply passing on an exaggerated account. This is hammered home by the fact that the Gospel of Mark originally ended with no post-death appearances. If the people listed by Paul really did see Jesus, you'd think Mark would have mentioned it in his Gospel. Additionally, there's one other interesting fact about eyewitness testimony that I left out of Part 1, and which I alluded to in Part 4. This is the surprisingly common and well-documented phenomenon of hallucinations without drugs. Hallucinations can be brought about by several different emotional and physiological states. For example, extreme grief can create what are called post-bereavement hallucinatory experiences, or PBHEs. One study found a strikingly high prevalence of PBHEs, ranging from 30% to 60% among widowed subjects, giving consistency and legitimacy to these phenomena. Of course, we don't really know how Jesus' followers felt after his death, but I would imagine that after losing your Messiah, for whom you may have sold all your possessions and abandoned your family because you genuinely believed that the end was near, you'd probably be grieving pretty hard. There is also evidence that feelings of guilt and shame can induce hallucinations, although this seems to be a more recent connection in this field of study. I bring this up because I can't help but wonder how a Jew might feel about persecuting his fellow Jews, who were already oppressed by the Romans, all the while thinking to himself, man, they seem so sure about this Jesus guy. That's right, I'm looking at you, Paul. Additionally, there's the interesting case study of the Sisala clan in Ghana by anthropologist Bruce Grindle. Grindle spent 2 years living with the Sisala clan, and at one point, he participated in a funeral ritual for a powerful drummer man who had recently died. During this ritual, Grindle and everyone around him claims to have seen the corpse of the man come back to life right in front of their eyes. In his 1983 paper, Grindle wrote, "The corpse, shaken by spasms, then rose to its feet, spinning and dancing in a frenzy. As I watched, convulsions in the pit of my stomach tied not only my eyes, but also my whole being into this vortex of power. It seemed that the very floor and walls of the compound had come to life, radiating light and power, drawing the dancers in one direction and then another. Then a most wonderful thing happened. The talking drums on the roof of the dead man's house began to glow with a light so strong that it drew the dancers to the rooftop. The corpse picked up the drumsticks and began to play. I cannot say whether what transpired took a matter of minutes or even an hour, nor can I be sure about the sequence of events which I witnessed. But after a while, the power which had filled the compound began to cool, and the body of the drummer was once again sitting proposed against the west wall of the compound." He goes on to say that while some people heard the man playing the drums, others did not. This account is cited in another interesting paper by neuropathologist Peter Craffert, in which he gives a broad overview of these types of experiences, explaining how various brain states can create them. What this means is that even if we accept the claim that multiple people saw Jesus alive again, at the same time and in the same place, this wouldn't actually prove that Jesus was physically resurrected. Alright, next objection. But if Jesus was a fraud, or if he didn't rise from the dead, people would have called out the deception. I'm sure people did, but as we saw in part 1, Satya Sai Baba has millions of devotees, despite many people calling him out for being a deceiver. I think Satya Sai Baba was a fraud, as likely you do, but that hasn't kept his followers from their belief. Likewise, I'm sure that many people did call out Jesus as a fraud, before and after his death, but that's simply not enough to stop a cult following. Heck, after Elvis Presley died, people started reporting him alive again, and they continued to do so for decades afterward. Calling them out did not stop them from seeing Elvis. Charismatic figures have always, and will always, be able to transcend rational criticism and hard evidence. Well then, how did Christianity spread so rapidly? Oh, I don't know. How did Mormonism end up with nearly 15 million members? How did Satya Sai Baba convince anywhere from 6 to 100 million people that he could perform miracles? Clearly, false ideas are more than capable of spreading rapidly, even when there is abundant evidence to the contrary. The mere fact of Christianity's spread does not speak to its truth value. So, given everything we've covered in this series, and the story of Jesus we've reconstructed, my conclusion is this. Christianity arose as a post hoc excuse for how Jesus could have been the Jewish Messiah, despite the fact that he clearly wasn't. Like telling any other lie, where the first lie spawns new lies until they create their own self-contained web, these rationalizations and just so stories eventually became a school of thought so radically different from Judaism that it was given an entirely new name: Christianity. The religion we now call Christianity is nothing more than an elaborate Jewish fanfiction, one which was created for the sole purpose of rationalizing a mistake and excusing the failures of a Jewish messianic manic. Like I've said before, my goal is not to prove that Jesus didn't exist, or that he didn't perform miracles, or even that my description of events is exactly what happened. My goal is simply to show that there is a much simpler explanation for why Christianity exists, and that, if modern Christians were presented with similar claims and similar evidence from another religion, especially if these claims could be explained in a non-miraculous way, they would have no trouble dismissing the claims of that other religion. The only reason why the Gospel's description of Jesus is compelling to modern Christians, and why the evidence seems so strong, is because they already believe it. Thank you for watching The Sketchy Story of Jesus. If you'd like to share this series, a full playlist is linked in the video description. Subscribe for more content like this, and consider clicking the bell because I don't upload very often.